To follow up on some of the things that were raised this morning, namely about how we actually interpret the smells that we sense and the smells of others. And so a lot of my work looks at very much the world nose first, and it concentrates from the nose into the external world. So just to point out that whilst I'm very aware of the sort of like the memory and the sort of like the psychology connections, my world is actually one that starts around about here somewhere and is concerned with making eye visible, because smells aren't invisible when we actually smell them. They're not invisible to the nose, they're just invisible to how we see them. So what I'm trying to do with this work is to actually make eye visible what the smellscape might actually look like if we could see it. And to this end, the methods that I use to do this type of work, I use sense walks, namely the smell walk, and there's a number of other people in this room that use those as well. I use graphic elicitation, which is something that you're going to be following through with today as well very quickly. And I use mapping techniques as a way of actually putting a spatial framework onto the temporal and ephemeral aspects of smell. And a recent piece of work, this is something that has happened since I last presented at this event. And it started with a tweet, a delayed flight, and a hat. And it ended up with a smell walk around Kiev on Christmas Day 2016 that I've translated into some new work. And this actually indicates, and it's quite different to Alex's approach, I say I know nothing more than anybody else. It's not up to me to determine a smellscape, it's up to the people that actually live in an environment to determine it for themselves. And what I do is I partly quantify their responses in order to be able to create these pieces. So this was 7 people. I followed their trajectory. They wrote down what they detected as they were walking around. And then I used some of the techniques that I've developed in order to be able to map their experiences of this Kiev smellscape. And so what you see there is they're slightly offset from each other so that you can see each of the individual routes. And along the bottom, I started doing a translation of where, if you actually take the spatial out of this detection of smell and you actually instead make that spatial into time, what happens as individuals notice smells? What are the rhythmic patterns that are indicated by this smellscape? And because you've got a walking rhythm, you've got a sniffing rhythm, you've got also different stages of the smell walk. What impact does that have, or does it have any, on how people actually sniff and note down smells in their environment? So as we were walking along, I start with providing a framework and a structure. So the structure of the smell walk, it starts with smell catching. And smell catching is opening your nostrils and actually being aware and noting that smells exist. So yes, we do breathe 24,000 times a day, roughly, but not every breath means that we ingest a smell. In order to actually smell things, you have to actively sniff. And that involves just a slightly different, it's a foregrounding of smell in a slightly different way. And so you foreground your sense of smell. You think first through smell. You use your eyes as a background sense for making sure you don't bump into anybody, but you foreground what's coming in through your nose first. So this is just pulling in smells from the air. If you think about a butterfly catcher, you're actually just sniffing in air and seeing what you can actually notice and detect. And so it was very cold. We started under the Maidan, which is sort of like the main square in the middle of Kiev, which is full of sort of like political ramifications and memories. And we went underground, and there's a big underground connective area that goes down to the metro, and it also filled with vendors, food vendors, flower shops, and sort of a lot more human traffic. So we go from about 0 degrees, where it's quite difficult to smell. Smells are less intense when it's colder. We went underground, where it's warmer, and there's much more activity. So one of the things that smells actually do is they very much index activity and human life as well. The next stage of the walk, after doing that for sort of 15 minutes or so, we then moved on to what I call smell hunting. And that's where you actually recognise the contribution of the polysensory in detecting the sensory aspects of a city around you. And with that, you listen, you watch, you touch things, you pick things up, you crush them, you look out for places where interesting smells might be. And that's resulted in people sniffing inside mailboxes, getting right down low to the ground. There was nothing in the mailbox, sadly. People get down low to the ground, they pick up samples. I've had people in London do it where they've actually gone up to a motorcyclist and asked if they can actually just sniff him all over, from helmet through to sort of like the chain of the bike, to detect the whole smellscape around a motorcycle courier. It's a really good exercise. You make a lot of friends that way. So that's the second part of it. And then what I did was actually looked at combining these temporalities and really trying to think about, sort of like, here we've got this quixotic, ephemeral sense. Every one of us perceives it slightly differently. How can we actually pull it together in a way that starts to make this idea of a smellscape understandable? And so I looked at the walking pace and how the different environments that we went through changed as we went along, how that affected the walking pace. At the start of the walk, everybody's very keen to get going, but they're also smoothly going through it because you're just sniffing the air. As soon as you get to the smell hunting stage, then it's a stop-start mechanism. Sometimes you're breathing in more deeply, sometimes you're stopping, sometimes you're turning around, you're going back on yourself. That then affects your sniff rhythm, and it also, your walking pace changes as a result of it. And so this is then from the static map, because of this ephemerality and the temporality of smell, I find that the static map is a lovely starting place. But what I then do is actually move it into an animated sequence. So what you're about to see are 7 people and the smells that, their smell detections, all placed and layered on top of each other. I've noticed today that a very common visual for marking anything on a map is this sort of target look. And that's exactly what I use for this. And it's useful because it marks 2 things. It marks a source or a starting point, and it also marks a range or an intensity. And so that's what you see here. For each concentric ring, somebody has marked that smell as being more intense on a scale of 0 to 6. Did it show? Now, what you also have with that is that I've based the length of each smell appearance on roughly how long it takes us to take one breath. So it's about 3 seconds in terms of the timing on it. So you've got a walk that was in effect at the end of it, a 2-hour-long walk, condensed into quite a short space of time, about 25 seconds worth there. And some of the things that it shows us, if you actually then take screen grabs from it, is that there are similarities of intensity and space and where we actually locate those smells. So a lot of them were at the start, and then there were more key stopping points. And then there's olfactory voids where there's very few smells noted during along the duration of the walk itself. This now is one person's trajectory, and this actually follows the spatial location of them as they were walking. But what it also brings into being are the meteorological conditions that would affect that smell. So what you're seeing here is a rendition of smells as they were detected, and then as they were actually shifted, potentially speculatively, in a wind, and then they would disappear completely, either because the walker had moved on or because the smells themselves have moved away in the westerly winds. And what then happens is that you see, different individuals have completely different smell rhythms. So to some people, smells are far more intense, and there's fewer of them. To other people, they're actually recording many more. I provide a sort of scaffolding and framework indicating how many smells people should be noting down. And what I love about the process is that nobody ever follows the instructions. And that's what makes for these things actually being much more interesting. What you're going to do today is, this is something that on the left-hand side of your screen up there, that's what came after the walk. So what you have there are different people's renditions of the most evocative or meaningful smell of Kiev to them, without any instruction. The wonderful thing about smell is because we have no pedagogy for it particularly, you don't learn about smell in school, you don't know how to visually represent it, it actually gives an enormous freedom. And there are a lack of constraints in them being able to deal with it. So a quick sort of like 60-second exercise with a watercolour kit and a brush and some cut-up pieces of paper resulted in these sort of like definitions of smellscapes for each of those individual walkers. And that's where I got the colours from, was from their sketches. And so you get, the top one up there is an incinerator. It's a garbage site in Kiev, and there's a whole political argument around that about why it needs to be developed, it needs to be changed. I think it still burns garbage and waste. The second one down is what was called an asylum, which was the underground space because of the cacophony of smells that were present. And then there's another one which is about the smells of summer in the middle of winter, conjured through a piece of green moss. On the right-hand side is another device which I use, which is a sort of smellscape visualizer. And that just allows people, again, to use colour and to think about how you might translate from one sensory modality into another. In order to do a quick exercise today, I'd like you to note that breathing is not sniffing and is not smelling, but can anybody detect anything just in the air at the moment? Lunch.
Like a kind of vegetable oily smell and bread.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah?
Women's perfumes.
Women's perfumes. Anybody get any male aftershave? No? Yeah? Okay. I've got a sudden smell of coffee that just came straight across the room on a wafting cloud. There is possibly no consensus about what we're ever going to get. So if you actually just put your nose to the back of your hand, if you ever want to reset your nostrils, just smell your own skin. Coffee, forget about it, that's no good. Your own skin is the ultimate reset button. And if you just breathe normally, you don't get a lot. But if you actually deliberately sniff and you take a deeper breath, you might get some other things wafting in from the side. They may not be describable, they may be very different to you. But in order to sniff properly, you actually have to flare your nostrils a little bit, and you actually have to pay attention to what's going on. If you were going to describe that smell to somebody, how might you describe it? That's metal. What do you have on your skin? Nothing special. I wonder where you've been. It's very interesting because metals actually don't smell per se. It's a human contact with metals that make them smell. So be interested to...
It's the smell of the slide, you know,
Yes. Yeah.
and the smell of
The handrail when you've got off it and you've... Yeah. Interesting. So your challenge for today is to do a very quick version of a smell walk. Because there's so many of you and there's only one of me, this is going to be a self-guided tour on your part. And I would like you to do some smell catching, which might mean walking around and just seeing what you can catch on the breeze. I'd like you to find one that you think is quite faint, and also to think about one that's quite strong. And then I'd like you to use your other senses, and I'd like you to do an object that is expected. So you might walk up to a croissant and say, yep, that smells like croissant. But then I'd also like you to see if you can find something that's unexpected. Please be aware of other people's privacy issues. But hair is lovely, really seriously lovely, and it holds a lot of smell in it. Materiality, anything that's got any water in it is particularly good. So wood, you can scratch surfaces, you can get brickwork, you can go outside, and I have no idea what the time is. So if you allow yourselves about 5 minutes to go off and collect for smells, you've got a little chart there. And then you're going to come back, and I've got some paints and some brushes, and I'd like you to visualize what you collect. Explain the smells that you encountered here without the visual to somebody. And then just see the difference in how you explain it and how they might understand it using the combination of the visual with it as well. So it's just a different way of actually thinking about how we might record and communicate this sensory information without being able to take somebody else along with you to exactly the same spot that you were in. So thank you for doing a sensory translation. I hope you've enjoyed it.